God blesses those who are persecuted for doing right, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. God blesses you when people mock you and persecute you and lie about you and say all sorts of evil things against you because you are my followers. Be happy about it. Be very glad, for a great reward awaits you in heaven. And remember, the ancient prophets were persecuted in the same way. Matthew 5, verses 10 through 12. We are told the faithful in Christ can expect two things: persecution in the world and blessing from God. Christ tells us, if the world hates you, remember it hated me first. The world would love you as one of its own if you belong to it. But you are no longer part of the world. I chose you to come out of the world, so it hates you. Do you remember what I told you? A slave is not greater than the master. Since they persecuted me, naturally they will persecute you. And if they had listened to me, they would listen to you. They will do this to you because of me, for they have rejected the one who sent me. And that's from the 15th chapter of John. Before I go much further, I think it's important to make a point about persecution and perceived persecution. Human beings have a remarkable tendency to rationalize their behavior. They trust in themselves that they are righteous, and therefore whatever they are doing must be righteous and the right thing to do. So commonly people use their ability to reason only in an attempt to justify their own ways rather than decide on what path to take in the first place. To illustrate this point, we might think of a compulsive gambler, the person that's driven by emotion and impulse to gamble excessively, for whatever reason. Maybe they get a lot out of risk taking, or maybe they get a high off a winning streak, even if it comes at the expense of overall losses. So it is not reason or evidence or looking at the big picture that drives the gambling addict. That said, the gambler will seek to justify his acts with reason, however flawed that reason may be. Whether it's just denial of the problem, or whether he tries to justify it by saying something like, you can't win if you don't play, or he may even reason while he's losing that, now he has to stay in at least long enough to get back to even. Now, if he had employed reason from the beginning, before he developed a thirst for gambling, he might have realized that gambling dens and casinos are not built on the house losing. The deck is always stacked in favor of the house. He could have researched the odds of winning the lottery and realized that there are much better ways to find a return on an investment. So what does any of this have to do with persecution in the New Testament? I wanted to point this out because some people will use perceived persecution to justify their behavior, and they might even point to verses like this as evidence. Because of the way people are, they might delude themselves into thinking legitimate criticism of them, or even legitimate punishment for wrongdoing on their part, is really persecution of the world. Remember, people tend to think they are good people and that whatever they do is right, so it's not a big stretch to think that God must be on their side. And if anyone starts to point out otherwise, this threatens to pop their comfort bubble, so they might reason this is persecution of the ungodly, and that they are justified in their actions by God. So to avoid falling into the persecution complex ditch, it would be wise to fully understand the context of these verses. First of all, it is blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness, not blessed are those who are prosecuted for actual crimes that they committed against others. So for example, if you down several alcoholic beverages, get in your car and pound the expressway at 120 miles an hour, don't blame it on biblical persecution if you get arrested, severely fined, or imprisoned for it. In that case, it is not that they are out to get you, but rather that you are begging to get caught. Peter speaks to this in his first epistle letter. Therefore submit yourself to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to governors, as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. As free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants to God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. For this is commendable, if because of good conscience towards God, one endures grief, suffering wrongfully. For what credit is it, if when you are beaten for your faults you take it patiently? But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps, who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth, who when he was reviled did not revile in return, when he suffered he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously. And that's from 1 Peter 2, verses 13 through 23. So Peter gives us a lot to sort through here. But if I could sum it up, I would say, don't let your conduct give your enemies any credibility in their accusations against you. You should strive to be an extremely well-mannered person in your conduct. If you are up to no good, or you are using liberty as a cloak for vice, as the verse says, then you have no reward from God when you suffer for it. For what credit is it if when you are beaten for your faults you take it patiently? If you do wrong and are punished for it, that is not praiseworthy. However, if you are doing good, and truly doing God's will, while others revile and persecute you for it, yet you are willing to endure it for the sake of doing good, that is praiseworthy and that is blessed. Peter also tells us to submit to earthly authorities, as such are there to punish the wicked and praise the righteous. Now at first glance this is a bit unsettling to somebody like myself who holds classical liberal views towards the government. I tend to view the state with great skepticism, and I value my autonomy. So at first glance Peter's thoughts on submitting to all governing authorities might seem to present a schism between my religious views and my political views. But I don't think Peter is preaching a sort of a blind statism, or telling us to place an undue faith in the benevolence of the state. Or, for example, when Jesus tells us, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, and unto God's the things that are God's, this should not be construed as a blanket endorsement of Caesar. In fact, it was a Roman governor, Pilate, who oversaw the execution of Jesus. Likewise, Peter himself is alleged to have been executed in the wake of the persecutions that Nero Caesar visited upon the early church. So I think the gist of what Peter was saying in submitting to authority is, don't go looking for trouble, and don't try to use Christian liberties as an excuse for doing wrong. That said, it is possible that your religious convictions, the mere fact that you happen to be a Christian, can bring you into conflict with the government that you live under. Certainly times and places where it was illegal to be a Christian, or to practice your faith publicly. And I think Peter's letter also gives us some insights into government generally. Governments historically derive much of their legitimacy from this function of enforcing moral codes. Or as Peter says, the governors are there to punish the wicked and praise the righteous. Take the example of Pontius Pilate. To his credit, he wished to wash his hands of the crucifixion of Jesus. He himself found no fault with Jesus. Nonetheless, he chose not to stop it. The religious leaders of that day, the scribes and the Pharisees in this case, saw Jesus as a threat and stirred the crowd into calling for his death. So, like a politician, Pilate, with his finger in the wind, sought to satisfy the crowd which wished to see Jesus executed. Certainly in theory, government is there to punish evildoers and leave good people alone. They derive much of their legitimacy with the public, because the public largely believes that's what the government does. However, we should not lose sight of the fact that the government is a human institution, and it's made up of corruptible individuals seeking to appease the corruptible populations they govern. Politics tends to be an ego fest and a popularity contest. Therefore, in light of that, as responsible citizens, especially as Christians, we ought to be very careful about what we ask government to do, lest we help cause good men to be condemned to death, or otherwise trample the rights of others. We ought to remember that it was the crowds, stirred on by the religious leaders, that lobbied and demanded Pilate to put Jesus to death. And that's another dynamic that we see at play. It wasn't Pilate alone, but it was also the religious elite of that community, lobbying the government to do something about Jesus. And this is a common thing not only in the biblical narrative, but also observed in history generally. Often a religious sect of one flavor or another gains influence with political figures and uses that influence to persecute people of other religious sects. In fact, this is one very common reason Christians are persecuted. Not only that, but it often comes at the hands of other so-called Christians. For many centuries in Europe, non-Catholic Christians faced persecutions in Catholic-dominated countries. At one time in England, Christians that didn't conform to the state Church of England, so-called Puritans and nonconformists, suffered persecutions of various forms. That's one of the reasons the Pilgrims left Europe and sought to settle in the New World. It was a place that they could go and practice the convictions of their conscience, largely unhindered by the state churches in Europe. And while the West likes to view themselves as classically liberal and intolerant of different cultures and religions, we ought not to forget that it was only a few centuries ago when men were burned alive for such crimes as merely printing the scripture in the common tongue. Powerful religious leaders in those days thought it was threatening to allow the laity to read the Bible for themselves in their own language, so they persecuted those that tried to make that happen. Religious sects that have tended to be the minorities in a given country often face persecutions by more powerful, politically connected religious sects, not unlike the Pharisees lobbying Pilate to nail Jesus to a cross. So with that in mind, let's look to Matthew chapter 12. This is where Christ is telling us to rejoice when we suffer persecutions. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So what does Jesus mean when he tells his disciples, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you? Throughout the biblical narrative, God's servants suffer at the hands of the world, often by their own countrymen, and even members of their own household. When Abel found favor with God, his brother Cain grew jealous and killed him. Likewise, Joseph, the youngest of Jacob's 12 sons, became the object of his brother's envy. Joseph's brothers resented him because they thought his father showed favoritism towards him. And when Joseph began to tell his brothers of the prophetic dreams that he had, his brothers grew so enraged that they beat him up and threw him down a well and left him for dead. Then after that they felt bad about it, so they fetched him out of the well and sold him off into slavery instead. If you look to the example of David in the Bible, as David's popularity grew, King Saul grew jealous and tried to have him killed, and drove David into exile for many years. In Elijah's time, King Ahab and his wife Jezebel, as well as much of the children of Israel, had turned to Baal worship. They had turned away from the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and instead began to worship Baal. Elijah, who spoke out against this, didn't make any friends with the Baal-worshipping community. Prophet Jeremiah was sent to warn his people of God's judgment against them in the coming Babylonian captivity, only to have his message rejected and to be beaten and to be cast into a well. In Babylon, Daniel refused to worship the king's graven image, so as a Jew, worshipping graven images violated his religious convictions, and for this he was thrown into a furnace. The New Testament, of course, is no picnic for God's followers either. John the Baptist is beheaded for his preaching. After Jesus' death and resurrection, the authorities in Judea sought to ban the preaching of Jesus. Peter and John were therefore beaten for continuing to preach the gospel in Jerusalem. Stephen is stoned to death for his testimony. And of course, Paul suffers many things after his conversion, and so forth. And in fact, the last 2 millennia of Christian history is ripe with examples of reformers, or just people of minority sects being persecuted for following the dictates of their conscience, for speaking out about what they believe. Therefore, the faithful follower of Christ has potentially many forms of persecution to suffer, but is ultimately blessed and vindicated of God. Consider what it is the prophets do. They are sent to a nation in rebellion against God in the midst of an ungodly world, and they go about telling people things about themselves that they don't want to hear. And they say things that those people don't want other people to hear. They threaten the status quo and turn people away from false forms of worship, putting them at odds with the leaders of those false practices. But truth is a controversial thing in a world of lies and delusions. In the 10th chapter of Matthew, Jesus is quoted, Students are not greater than their teacher, and slaves are not greater than their master. Students are to be like their teacher, and slaves are to be like their master. And since I, the master of the household, have been called the prince of demons, the members of my household will be called even worse names. But don't be afraid of those who threaten you, for the time is coming when everything that is covered will be revealed, and all that is secret will be made known to all. What I tell you now in the darkness, shout abroad when daybreak comes. What I whisper in your ear, shout from the rooftops for all to hear. Don't be afraid of those who want to kill your body. They cannot touch your soul. Fear only God, who can destroy both soul and body in hell. What is the price of 2 sparrows, 1 copper coin? But not a single sparrow can fall to the ground without your Father knowing it, and the very hairs of your head are numbered. So don't be afraid, you are more valuable to God than a whole flock of sparrows. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you, and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you.